there's a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. A dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. It is a dimension of imagination, and it exists in an area which we call the Twilight Zone. That was Rod Serling's introduction to his 1959 show that ran for about 4 or 5 years called The Twilight Zone. My name is Bill McDonald. I'm an adult service librarian for the Charlotte County Library System. And this is Author Talk, and today we're going to be exploring the work of Rod Serling. If you want to look at misconceptions about him from the Twilight Zone that a lot of people had, one, that he was just the host. Although he was the host of the show, he wrote about 75% of the episodes. The other misconception was that Serling came from a big background of fantasy and science fiction, like Isaac Asimov or somebody along those lines. Actually, he was a celebrated dramatist in the golden age of television. That a lot of his work was on the Kraft Television Theater and Playhouse 90 in the 50s. And his first notable work that really kind of brought attention to him as a writer was a teleplay called Patterns. Patterns took place in a corporation where a young man was hired for a high corporate position, and his position was to replace a current individual who was nearing retirement. And this poor individual that was nearing retirement, they didn't fire him, they just had the younger guy that they were grooming for the position harass him, demean him, sabotage his work. And of course, the younger man that's being forced to do this starts to resent it and realizes the harm that he's causing this senior individual who's nearing retirement. The individual who's nearing retirement has a heart attack and dies, and the young man must confront his value system about working for the corporation. This was one of the first teleplays that actually examined what it's like to work in an everyday job or a job that a lot of people aspire to, and what are some of the darker sacrifices that people have to make to, quote unquote, become successful. Patterns won Rod Serling an Emmy Award and set him kind of as the angry young man, up and coming young writer for serious dramatic work on television. His next teleplay that became very successful for Rod Serling was Requiem for a Heavyweight. And they had a teleplay on, it was either Kraft Television Theater or Playhouse 90, and then an actual feature film. The television version had Jack Palance in the title role. The film had Anthony Quinn. Requiem for a Heavyweight is about a boxer named Mountain McClintock who never quite really made it, who showed a lot of promise as a fighter but never achieved championship level. And he's at a point in his career where he's taken a lot of punches, a lot of abuse, and the doctor that examines him realizes that he's probably not able to go on to too many fights, that he might be in danger to his health. And then he finds out that his manager has even started betting against him in fights, and he tries to get other work and finds that life is even more of a struggle once he's beginning to leave boxing. Requiem for a Heavyweight won another Emmy Award for Rod Serling, and his next big teleplay that he got a lot of renown for was Velvet Alley. And Velvet Alley, Rod Serling drew upon his own experience as a successful writer for film and television, and it's about a writer for film and television that is out in Hollywood and very successful, but that success becomes a trap. He finds that he doesn't have enough time to spend with his family. He starts chasing after other women. He desires more material things, tries to keep up with his successful neighbors, and of course his work suffers along the way. So those three patterns, Requiem for a Heavyweight and Velvet Alley, really established Rod Serling as one of the premier writers of dramatic television in the 50s. And one of the reasons why he established the Twilight Zone was that even with all this success, 3 Emmy Awards, he still was being censored by the networks and the sponsors, the television sponsors. They were worried about controversial subjects or socially relevant subjects. And what really got him to kind of realize that he wanted to create a series on his own was when he wrote a teleplay called Noon on Doomsday. Now that was based on the Emmett Till case. Emmett Till was an African American who was wrongfully accused of whistling at a white woman. This was back in 1955. I believe Emmett Till lived in Mississippi, or he was on vacation in Mississippi visiting some relatives. And some thugs kidnapped him and murdered him, and those individuals that kidnapped and murdered him were acquitted and did not serve any jail time. So Rod Serling wrote Noon on Doomsday based on the Emmett Till case. And what happened to his teleplay was that they changed a whole bunch of important details. Like instead of being an African American, it became a young African American. It became a Middle Eastern American, or somebody from the mid-Europe, or who was in his 50s. The geographical location changed from the South to New England, and the mention of lynching was taken out because it was deemed too Southern in connotation. So Rod, at this point, decided that he was going to start producing and writing stories that focused on science fiction, fantasy, and then he would be able to sneak in socially relevant issues, some controversial views on different subjects if they were based in science fiction and fantasy. So that's what really got him to start the Twilight Zone, was censorship, which I think is real interesting. If we if we look at Rod Serling's background, the day after he graduated from high school, he enlisted in the Army in World War II, and he went underwent paratrooper training, became a paratrooper. And one incident that really made a strong impression and a strong visceral impression on Rod Serling was seeing one of his friends, Corporal Levy. He was doing some comic bits for the men, and Rod Serling was laughing at Corporal Levy's impressions of their commanding officer, when a crate of food was dropped by a nearby airplane, and it killed Corporal Levy. And Rod Serling ended up giving the eulogy at the little makeshift funeral that they had for Corporal Levy, and that really kind of got him to kind of question things and to want to write about serious subjects. He also took up boxing too, and boxed for a while, which gave him a lot of insight in writing Requiem for a Heavyweight. When he got out of the Army, he went to Antioch College, started writing radio plays, and met his wife, and they got married and had children. He started writing for the radio, and then television began to take off, and he wrote something like somewhere like 200 scripts before one of his scripts were accepted, and then he started hitting it big with patterns in Requiem for a Heavyweight. When we look at Twilight Zone, if you look at some of the various episodes, you'll see that they weren't just stories of science fiction or fantasy. They were often stories of human conflict with social issues. One that I think stands out is teleplay and an episode of the Twilight Zone called Eye of the Beholder. Now, Eye of the Beholder is about a woman named Janet Tyler. You only see her in the beginning of the episode bandaged. Her whole face is in bandaged. The doctors, the medical staff are not visible. You can only hear their voices. They're kind of off camera and darkened. And the medical staff, the doctors and the nurses, say that Janet Tyler has undergone 12 unsuccessful facial reconstructive surgeries. And they're hoping that this one will actually prove successful. You still don't see the medical staff. They unravel Janet Tyler's bandages, and you see that she's a very attractive woman by contemporary viewer standards. Then the camera begins to slowly pan on the medical staff, and the medical staff are revealed to be hideous creatures with sunken eyes and flaring nostrils and just very grotesque-looking creatures, half animal, half human sort of looking. And they tell Janet Tyler that she shouldn't feel too bad about her reconstructive surgery not panning out. So then Janet Tyler is in hysterics. She runs down the corridor. She is met by another gentleman who looks very much like us, and he tells Janet Tyler that they're going to take her to a planet of her own kind where her ugliness will not be offensive to the state. So you kind of get, when you look upon it, it's about segregation, it's about separating people who are different from the mainstream. And so that not only looks at the way we regard physical attractiveness of people, but also color of skin, the ethnic background of an individual, and the whole idea of segregation in itself. So Twilight Zone was able to use these stories of imagination and science fiction and also put socially relevant issues in as well. And then after the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling actually tried a Western called The Loner. And unfortunately, the network felt that it was too strong on character development and not strong enough on action, so they parted ways. The next big project that Rod Serling worked after the Twilight Zone and after The Loner was on developing a book for a movie. The book was The Planet of the Apes, and Rod Serling began to develop that as a screenplay. He had several drafts of it, and the studio decided to keep a lot of it, but they didn't want to shoot all of his script because they felt that Serling's version of The Planet of the Apes was too futuristic and too expensive. So they hired another writer named Michael Wilson. And one of the things that Serling came up with is at the very end of the movie, and this is spoiler alert if you haven't seen the original Planet of the Apes, when Charlton Heston, thinking this is another planet, rides on horseback on the beach, and he sees the Statue of Liberty lying there, realizing that he's not on another planet and that there must have been a nuclear war. And it's just such a brilliant visual. And he doesn't, Heston doesn't mention anything about a war. You know, he just grabs his neck and says, "Oh my God," or "damn," or whatever. And it's really a wonderful ending, and Serling developed that. After Planet of the Apes, Serling was asked to host a show called Night Gallery, which featured stories ghost stories, stories of the macabre, stories of the occult, and very much like the Twilight Zone, where Serling was the host, he also featured as the curator of the night gallery, introducing paintings that would kind of play into that particular story that would be featured, that horror story or ghost story. He wrote some of the episodes, but after a year or two, he noticed that they started rejecting his scripts, and they didn't feel that Serling's work on Night Gallery. Now, of course, when you look back on the Twilight Zone, he wrote about 75% of the scripts. Night Gallery is probably writing a third of the scripts. They felt that Serling's work on Night Gallery wasn't shocking enough, wasn't scary enough, and Serling said, "I don't have anything against zombies in a graveyard if those zombies have something to say." And that, of course, he mentioned that to the producers, and the producers just laughed at them. So he parted way on Night Gallery, and that show eventually was canceled. After that, Serling mainly taught at Ithaca College, and he worked with young kids, young college kids, teaching media, teaching film, and he really had them break down every movie or every television episode and challenge the way they would have done it better. And he was a really great teacher as well. He did die at 50. He was a chronic smoker, and he had a series of heart attacks. So he died at a very young age. What is the influence of Rod Serling? Well, certainly was a big influence on Star Trek and The Outer Limits, as well as Gene Roddenberry said he was a big influence with Star Trek. Also, The X-Files. Jordan Peele, who did Get Out, is now hosting his own version of the Twilight Zone, which are new Twilight Zone pieces that are written for cable. And I think that Serling also not only influenced science fiction, but he also greatly influenced the dramatic series that we take for granted today, whether it's Mad Men or Breaking Bad or The Sopranos. That commitment to hard-hitting dramatic shows that explore social issues. And I think it's important to remember that he was more than just a host of a show, and he was one of our supreme and premier writers for television. Thank you.